Mortgage and Housing Corporation, CMHC, is tasked with overseeing housing programs for First Nations communities, including funding construction, rehabilitation, and maintenance of housing. However, these programs have been criticized for not adequately addressing the unique needs of First Nations, leading to subpar housing conditions on reserves across Canada. In particular, CMHC's oversight has raised concerns regarding stringent renovation requirements, penalties for noncompliance, and the historical context of systemic racism. This essay will explore CMHC's role, the challenges First Nations face with CMHC's policies, and the call for reforms to create safer and more adequate housing in Indigenous communities. CMHC's role in First Nations housing. The CMHC is responsible for overseeing the On-Reserve Nonprofit Housing Program, Section 95, which provides financial assistance to First Nations for constructing, purchasing, rehabilitating, and managing affordable housing on reserves. Under this program, First Nations must ensure that new and renovated housing units meet the National Building Code of Canada or equivalent standards. This is intended to ensure that homes are safe, livable, and sustainable. CMHC provides funding to support these projects, but it has faced criticism for imposing strict building code requirements that can limit the ability of First Nations to maintain or renovate housing effectively. Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, 2023. Under Section 95, the process of renovating homes can be hindered by several barriers. First, the need to comply with the National Building Code of Canada means that renovations must pass inspections and meet strict standards before funding is approved. This includes submitting detailed reports and ensuring compliance at various stages of construction, CMHC 2023. These requirements often create significant delays and additional costs for First Nations communities, making it difficult for them to maintain housing stock, especially in remote or underfunded areas. As a result, CMHC's regulations may inadvertently hinder necessary repairs, which in turn impacts the quality of housing on reserves. Penalties for noncompliance. Failure to comply with CMHC's requirements can lead to serious consequences, including the withdrawal of funding or the need to repay loans that were previously deemed forgivable. These penalties can create a financial burden on First Nations communities, making it difficult for them to manage and maintain their housing without risking the loss of essential resources. Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, 2023. The potential for disqualification from future CMHC programs further exacerbates the situation, leaving First Nations without adequate support for housing initiatives. Despite these challenges, CMHC's funding is critical to the survival of housing programs, and the need for reform is evident in the growing concerns surrounding these penalties. Systemic racism and its impact on First Nations housing. The issue of systemic racism within the housing sector is one that has been long-standing and deeply entrenched. The history of the Indian Act and colonial policies has fostered an environment of discrimination, which continues to affect housing conditions for First Nations today. CMHC has acknowledged the need to address systemic racism within its operations. In 2020, CMHC appointed a special advisor to oversee a new reconciliation framework that aims to remove racism from all levels of the organization, CMHC 2021. However, despite these efforts, concerns persist about whether CMHC's policies are fully equipped to address the realities faced by First Nations communities. Racial bias among inspectors is a significant concern, as there is no standardized oversight to ensure impartiality in housing assessments. There are fears that inspectors may bring unconscious biases into their evaluations of on-reserve housing, which could result in inaccurate reports or unfair treatment. For instance, First Nations communities have expressed frustration over the fact that housing conditions on reserves are often deemed inadequate, while similar conditions in non-Indigenous communities might not attract the same scrutiny. FN Inspector, 2021. The systemic inequalities that persist within federal housing programs contribute to these perceptions of bias, further undermining trust between First Nations communities and CMHC. Calls for reform. Recognizing these ongoing challenges, the Assembly of First Nations, AFN, has called for a comprehensive overhaul of federal housing programs. The AFN advocates advocates for reforms that would address the unique needs of Indigenous communities and allow them more autonomy in managing their housing needs. One key recommendation is to ensure that First Nations have access to sufficient funding to construct and maintain homes that meet their specific cultural and community requirements. Assembly of First Nations, 2020. Additionally, the AFN supports the establishment of a separate and distinct housing program that would be co-developed with First Nations, ensuring that Indigenous leadership is at the forefront of decision-making regarding housing policy. Furthermore, initiatives like the First Nations Inspection Authority, FNIA, founded by the Enoch Cree Nation, have emerged as a response to these challenges. FNIA provides culturally appropriate inspection services for on-reserve housing and ensures that inspections are conducted fairly and impartially. This is seen as an important step towards decolonizing the inspection process and ensuring that First Nations communities are not subject to biased assessments. FNIA, 2021. Conclusion. While CMHC plays a crucial role in supporting housing development on reserves, the current structure of housing programs is insufficient to meet the needs of First Nations communities. The stringent requirements for renovations, coupled with penalties for non-compliance, create significant barriers for First Nations in maintaining safe and adequate housing. Moreover, the historical legacy of systemic racism continues to affect the housing sector, raising concerns about the impartiality of inspectors. There is a clear need for policy reforms that would empower First Nations communities to manage and maintain their housing effectively, without the constraints imposed by CMHC's current framework. By addressing these issues and fostering a more collaborative, culturally sensitive approach, Canada can move towards a more just and equitable housing system for First Nations.